Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Sellgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Hi, welcome back. Today, on April 27th, 2022, we're going to be talking about what is happening right now in Florida, where Florida Governor Ron DeSantis recently signed legislation that strips Walt Disney World of its independent special district status after the company objected to the state's new law regarding classroom discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity. We will be using this opportunity to talk about what's dividing the conservative movement right now and what this guy is doing about it. I'm excited to be speaking with Klein today on this issue. He's the editor of the National Review Online and the author of 2 books. He has an interesting name for the conservatives that use this tactic, like DeSantis, which is the Fight Club conservatives, which we will get into. Welcome, Philip.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, first I want to ask you, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Well, I don't know if I would say, don't know about it, but I would say, if we reframe it a bit to say, what don't they care about that they should? I would say our national debt problem. And I think it's just sort of not popular right now to talk about. It was a big issue publicly about 10 years ago, but then both parties mutually decided they're just not going to worry about it anymore. But right now, our debt as a share of the economy is greater than at any time since World War II. But the difference was that after World War II, once the emergency ended, we just started reducing our spending to more normal levels, and our debt steadily dwindled. So it was fine. But in this case, we're just coming off the emergency of COVID, where we spent $6 trillion, and it blew up our debt so that now our debt again is larger than the annual output of the economy. And this is coming at a time where already we were facing huge debt burdens because of the combination of the retirement of the baby boomers, people living longer, and rising healthcare costs. And this is all going to fall on your generation because a lot of the older generations are going to be gone by the time everything hits the fan. Basically, it's not a pretty sight because at some point, the government's going to face really tough decisions between dramatic tax increases, dramatic, immediate spending cuts, some combination of the both, or inflation that makes what we're experiencing now seem like child's play. And nobody wants to do anything about it. And the younger generation is the generation that actually could create pressure to do something about it, because the older generations, they're benefiting from the current system. They're getting benefits, Social Security, Medicare benefits. They're certainly not going to lobby for things to be changed. So what politicians face is that there's no consequences for them to maintain the unsustainable status quo, because on the one hand, if they do anything, the older generations who are politically active are going to kill them for it. And the younger generations really just don't care about this issue. So I think it's crucial for younger generations to really start caring and becoming passionate about this issue and providing a counterweight to the old age lobby, or else they're going to face really dire consequences in the coming decades.
You laid out this issue so well. I haven't heard someone explain it so concisely yet while conveying just how bad it is. I've been struggling recently because it feels as though I'm really aware of the debt problem and I'm really into economics. And so it seems to me that this is a huge issue, but all my friends are concerned with things like global warming. But all I hear when they talk about stuff like that is spend money, spend money, spend money. We have to spend money. But we don't have money to spend. We're so far in debt, right? Do you have any recommendations of what someone my age, like me, should do to get the ball rolling or to raise awareness? Because no one my age seems to be paying this any mind.
I mean, look, we're in the midst of a discussion right now where the president is considering by executive fiat wiping out $1.5 trillion of student debt, even though people took out these loans, knowing what the consequences were, even though a lot of people struggled for years to pay and made all sorts of sacrifices to pay off their loans. A lot of people chose not to go to college because it's too expensive. And the government is contemplating without Congress, because they don't have the votes in Congress, of just trying to wipe away this debt, which, by the way, would have tremendous inflationary consequences, because if somebody is sort of used to paying $500 a month in student loans and suddenly they never don't have to pay that money, they're not going to be putting that money into savings. I could assure you. But anyway, to your point, I think that it is a really difficult question. I've actually written a book quite specifically on this subject, and it's difficult. I think that, unfortunately, I think that it's important to continue to make the case and try to explain and reality and point out the statistics and the trajectory. The difficulty is that it's just human nature to think of what's right in front of you and think of the short term and not think of the long-term consequences of short-term decisions. And so it's, and interestingly enough, when it comes to climate change, the younger generation is very much of the point of, well, let's make all these sacrifices in order to avert this calamity that could happen decades from now. But when it comes to finances, it's completely the opposite. And they just think that we could just spend money without consequence forever.
We haven't seen the consequence yet, or at least in the way that we will, because of the amount that we're in debt. And I think that's part of the reason why we haven't seen yet what is to come. This topic is so difficult to think about. It might be scary for some people. I mean, I'm scared, but I'm more scared that people don't seem to care. I'm going to read your book, and listeners, I recommend that you do the same. We do need to spend some time trying to solve this debt issue, but let's jump into what's happening right now, because that's important too. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis stripped Disney of its 50-year-old special district status after the company decided to vent its opposition to a piece of legislation that is often referred to in the media as the Don't Say Gay bill. Before we dive into what that is and what the special district status is and all of that, we kind of need some background. So first, what is the Don't Say Gay bill about?
So the bill has come after a couple of years in which there's been a huge parental backlash against schools and school curriculum. And I've argued that a lot of this was really tied to the lockdowns and the school closures of COVID, which had multiple effects. One is that it got parents really angry and frustrated as the schools shifted their goalpost and kept on coming up with excuses to delay the reopenings of schools. And two, it made people more aware of what was being taught in their schools. And so, and a lot of them didn't like what they saw. And thirdly, I think parents got more active because they were sort of organizing against a lot of school closures and mask mandates and so forth. And that sort of created a certain infrastructure for them to activate and become organized in other areas. And though Florida under Ron DeSantis opened schools up pretty quickly and was not heavy on the COVID lockdowns, I think that it's important context that you have this sort of nationwide movement against the various trends in curriculum in schools. Some of them and the two major touch points are critical race theory and gender identity training. And there's sort of a lot of debate and mischaracterization in the media, but essentially this isn't, with the CRT front, nobody's saying you can't teach slavery. The idea is that critical race theory is talking about teaching is sort of going against the ideology that a lot of people grew up with, and the sentiment, which is that we're supposed to not treat people as individuals and not about their race. And then suddenly there's this movement that's urging people to think about everything through the prism of race, to think about American history through the lens only of institutional racism, and that everything, and that slavery is embedded in literally every institution. And that is sort of different than just, sort of teaching about the brutal history of slavery and the civil rights, the terrorism of that followed in terms of white suppression of Black voting rights and so forth, which is all legitimate history that no one's arguing about. And then within that, you have this idea of gender. And the issue is that we're now in a situation in which a lot of parents are frustrated that you can't sort of say obvious things that were once true, such as that were once seen as indisputable and not up for debate. Things such as, men can't have babies, and men. It can't, calling people like men, people who menstruate and so forth. And within this context, Florida passed a bill that sort of avoided some of the trends in other states, which was to try to address the issue of gender, starting as early as kindergarten, and trying to teach kids essentially that gender is more of a feeling and is more fluid than just a simple binary. And a lot of parents saying this shouldn't be an issue for kindergartners. 5-year-olds don't need to be, told that they should be questioning their gender, and it's somehow just a social construct. And so they passed a bill that said that nobody from, kindergarten through second grade should be allowed to be taught these sexual about, various things regarding sexual identity and sexual situations and so forth. And there was a big debate about the wording of it and what would it mean in practice and so forth, which is kind of beyond the scope of this background. But essentially, because of the characterization, which I think was unfair, but the characterization in the media and among opponents is the Don't Say Gay bill, arguing that somehow it would prevent anyone from saying they're gay and like near a child or something, that was really what it's about. Because of that, it was hugely controversial. And so Disney, after not really having played a role in the bill at all, at the sort of 11th hour was pressured into their by their employees into taking a stand and coming out and saying they oppose this bill, and they apologized for their employees for not expressing their opposition earlier and so forth. And Ron DeSantis basically reacted by signing the bill anyway. He said he wasn't going to let, woke corporations set the agenda for Florida. He pointed out fairly the hypocrisy of Disney trying to lecture Florida when they're routinely make various compromises to their purported values to operate and distribute their films in China. And this was widely celebrated in the conservative movement as a huge victory. And after this happened, Christopher Rufo of the Manhattan Institute released a lot of videos that he had gotten his hold of, which were from an internal Zoom call that they had in Disney, reacting to this issue in the Florida law. And in the call, there were a number of producers and content creators at Disney talking about their efforts to inject LGBTQ characters and messages into children's programming, which further inflamed a lot of conservatives and made them, angry. And many of them were talking about boycotting Disney products. And up until that point, I would say that most conservatives were more or less, broadly speaking, supportive of DeSantis. But then what happened was that the DeSantis, the state legislature of Florida, decided to revisit this special district status that Disney World has. And it's this kind of very unique situation, which is that Disney, when they wanted to build Disney World in the 1960s, the area surrounding Orlando was miles and miles and miles of just undeveloped land. So Disney basically said, we want to come in here and build a theme park. And the local government said, well, we don't want to pay for all the infrastructure and all the stuff that would take to create this. And so Disney said, okay, well, how about we build everything and you don't, and we just are able to have freedom to sort of deal with our own zoning stuff, and we'll build our own roads, we'll take care of our own sanitation, and we'll take care of everything, but just sort of give us the freedom to build as we want. That's the central to that region of Florida's economy. And it's a massive complex that's the size of San Francisco, where they have roads, transportation, sanitation, and they're able to zone for themselves. And, as critics say, well, if they wanted to build a nuclear power plant there, they could, and the local government couldn't say anything. And so it is this sort of self-governance aspect to it. Now, so critics are saying, well, if they're sort of attacking us, then we should hammer them and take away this sort of special goodie that Disney gets. of course, it's a bit more complicated there. As my colleague at National Review, Charlie Cook, who lives in Florida, has pointed out, there are actually a few thousand of these special districts. Actually, the Villages, which is a senior citizen community, a vast one in Florida, has the same status. And actually, DeSantis made his announcement about the Disney bill at this place. And so the issue is, from my perspective, is that you could argue either way as whether Disney having this special status is good or bad or fair or not, and there are legitimate arguments to have. However, it's quite clear if you look at the rhetoric of DeSantis and his supporters that this was explicitly done as retaliation to Disney for taking a stand against this bill. And in my view, that's wrong, that you basically should make policies because they're good or bad, and the policy should be neutral toward the political stances of a company. And a lot of conservatives, because they're frustrated with, and I think that I would agree with them in a lot of the criticism where we've seen efforts by companies to try to bully states who are conservatives against supporting various conservative policies. We saw this, for instance, in Georgia when they passed a voting bill, and there was a big uproar by a lot of corporations, and the Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game out of Georgia. And so there's been this brewing discontent for corporations by a lot of conservatives who want to draw blood and believe that you have to bludgeon these corporations because the corporations are afraid of angering the left, but they think that because conservatives are so pro-business that they don't have anything to fear from conservatives. And they feel like, we have to punch some of these corporations in the nose and make them bleed and keep doing it until they back off and start behaving, stop being essentially enforcers for the left in the culture war. And that's sort of that perspective. But, I'm of the view that essentially DeSantis stood up to the corporations. He signed the bill. He basically told Disney to pound sand. And a lot of conservatives were critical of Disney. And I think a couple of weeks ago, people thought maybe Disney shouldn't have stuck their neck into this situation. And it seemed like DeSantis won. So it just seemed on every level, this is unnecessary. And there's likely to be a lot of litigation surrounding this in the coming years. And so the special district status under the law, I should note, doesn't expire technically until June 23, and it can be renewed at that point. So there's still some debate over whether or not DeSantis will get some concession out of Disney, and then they'll just sort of extend it because there's all sorts of legal ramifications if they go through with it in terms of unwinding this status.
On special district statuses, there are 38,000 of them approximately nationwide. I think most universities count if they have their own police force. So, for example, the University of Virginia has its own police force, and I think that's what makes it count. Hospitals count in many cases. Essentially, a special district status is a form of local governance. It's recognition of that. And so Disney's not special when there are 38,000 of them. I assume it's not easy to remove this status also, and that Florida is going to be tied up in years of costly litigation to figure out how to disentangle the company from the counties that it's surrounded by, and if it's even possible. Do you think that means that it's unlikely to happen then?
Yeah, I mean, there was a story in Miami Herald that pointed out the issue of the bonds, that there are billions of dollars in bonds that are still outstanding because essentially Disney issues bonds to, just like a city would issue bonds to pay for various services, and then it pays off those bonds over time. Now, what happens with all those bonds if the status is revoked is unclear, and it's going to be the subject of litigation. And there's a clause in the U.S. Constitution that it basically says the government cannot interfere. They can't make any law that would interfere with a contract between two parties. And so a bond issue is a contract. We loan you the money and then you pay us off over this amount of time. And so those bondholders have to be made whole. Who's going to pay for it? Is it, it could result if it were just passed on to the counties and the counties had to absorb everything. According to one calculation, it could result in a property tax assessment of $2,000 per household. DeSantis has sort of said, well, that's not going to happen and we're going to figure it out and Disney's going to pay for it. But Disney is not going to want to pay for it because they're going to say, well, why are we going to pay for billions of dollars when you had, this was the reason for it was that we were going to have this special district status, and now that's no longer there. And the bondholders are going to have to get paid, and so there's going to be they'd have standing to file lawsuits. So it's a complete debacle, and it's really surprising because DeSantis has picked many different battles as governor, and that have made him a lightning rod. And in most cases, he's been very strategic about the battles that he fought. On COVID, he early on made, to his credit, made the decision to say that there doesn't appear to be a huge difference between implementing all of these lockdown and other COVID restrictions and just letting people make their decisions on their own. And so we're just going to let people make their own decisions. And you could argue that, well, Florida would have had fewer cases if they went the full Fauci. But the question really isn't that. The question is, was it really worth the trade-off? So, schools were open after a very short closure in Florida. Businesses were booming. People are moving down there. And so that was sort of a very smart calculation that I think he was vindicated on for most people. I mean, there are some who say he kind of went too far, but regardless, I'd say that most people are now in the position of essentially recognizing that a lot of the COVID stuff didn't really move the needle enough to be justified. And there are a lot of other issues in which I feel like he was very strategic about it. And in this issue, it was, essentially it already won the fight. And then he just picked this new thing that is sort of extraneous to the central idea, which was supposed to be giving parents more control over the curriculum.
There seems to be a First Amendment issue here. Are you concerned about conservative support for this move and further abandoning the long-standing distinctions between private action like Disney and state action like revoking this special district status, and between the power of the state and the power of the corporate world as it relates to First Amendment issues?
I think it's kind of confusing because the issue of whether or not a court would find it to have violated the First Amendment is a tricky one. Because on the one hand, nobody is saying that Florida, if it wanted to go this route, that they have no ability. The state legislature. This is not something that he just did with the stroke of the pen. It went through both chambers of the state legislature, and he signed it. So most people think, the various legal technicalities and these arguments that are going to be that we already discussed aside, the issue is sort of, let's just say for the sake of discussion that the legislature can do this. The issue then becomes, well, are you targeting a company because of a position that they made? And now, had DeSantis maybe pursued this in a more savvy manner, it might have been harder to make the argument because a court is sort of reluctant to say that if a government takes an action that it otherwise could take, it's hard to then intuit the motive behind why they took that action and say, well, this action was taken for illegitimate reasons to try to stifle First Amendment speech. That said, there could be an argument that essentially because it was made so explicitly about targeting woke corporations and all of the rhetoric surrounding it, nobody could seriously argue that had Disney maintained silence in the whole fight over the parental rights bill, that we would be talking about this now, right? And there are plenty of statements that you could point to that this was vindictive. And further supporting this is actually in another bill, which I thought was bad that DeSantis signed, is basically he signed a bill that last year in which Florida targeted big tech companies. But that bill exempted Disney at the time, Disney Plus. However, in the new legislation that they passed, in addition to getting rid of this special district status, they amended the big tech bill to strip away the carve out for Disney. Now, the big tech bill was bad to begin with, and the carve out for Disney made it even worse. But it's even worse to then say, well, we gave this carve out when Disney was we felt Disney was on our side, but then we took out the carve out once they crossed us. So I think that there is a compelling argument that you could make that essentially they're trying to manipulate government policy and determine government policy on the basis of political speech, and that it could have an overall chilling effect by and in fact is intended to have a chilling effect of preventing other companies from wanting to speak out. So that is a sort of a thorny issue, and I'm certainly no constitutional scholar, but I would say that a lot of times in our debates, we sort of talk about free speech, and not everything that is sort of an act of trying to stifle speech is necessarily a violation of the First Amendment. And so I like to talk, like when we talk about, say, college campuses, disinviting speakers, or social media companies, banning certain people, right? Obviously, this is a government entity, so it's a different issue, but you're also, again, talking about a government entity doing something that maybe they could do. However, I think that there's this distinction between free speech as it applies specifically to First Amendment law and the broader concept of open speech. And I like to talk about open speech because I feel like it's important to always defend the principle that people should broadly be able to express their views, and that we should have, a very lax trigger finger when it comes to targeting corporations or individuals from expressing views. And that's been my view when it comes to debates over social media or speakers on college campuses. I feel like people need to just sort of deal with it if they disagree with someone. And I think it's the same thing with corporations. I think that if a Democratic government were targeting Chick-fil-A because Chick-fil-A donated money to pro-life causes, I think that everyone now arguing that DeSantis did the right thing would be arguing that the Democrat who went after Chick-fil-A is violating the First Amendment.
How is DeSantis's move and this shift in conservatives, how is it a departure from conservative tactics of the past? And how are these tactics dividing conservatives today?
Well, it's happening among a much larger debate among conservatives, which is that I wrote a piece recently talking about how in the sort of post-Trump world, the big dividing line among conservatives isn't necessarily ideology, although there are certainly genuine policy disagreements. It's about tactics and strategy. And basically, there's one side of which I subscribe to, which believes that conservatism is a set of timeless principles that should be defended, regardless of whether or not, in every case, upholding those principles always gets you the outcome that you want. I mean, just sort of to give one example, if, as a conservative, I have contempt for people who burn the American flag, I still think it's their constitutional right to do so, right? So that has traditionally been a sort of conservative. I mean, Scalia famously took that position and so whereas there's another side that says the left are bullies and they are willing to use government power to get their agenda. They're willing to destroy people, as we saw, for instance, in the Kavanaugh hearings. They control the media. They go after people. They sort of created this idea that Trump was stole the election with Russia, and everyone bought into that and pushed that for years. And there are, they give a lot of legitimate examples of the left behaving in a bad manner. And they say, look, you can't let the left continuously bludgeon you. And then when you're in power, say, well, we're not going to go after the left because of principles. And so that is the sort of, there's this very much, I refer to it as gangster government, but there is this view that we got to take care of our friends when we're in power and target our enemies. And that is a very unconservative viewpoint in my mind. In the mind of people who disagree with me, my position is a defeatist position because it means that the left will always, essentially, when they're in power, make gains, and then conservatives come in and they do nothing. I obviously disagree with that characterization and think that conservatives have done a lot of things when they've taken power, and that I think that in the long run, it does not benefit conservatism to abandon the idea of limiting government and of restraint among people in power. And I think that things could always escalate, and there's no doubt that Democrats are watching what's going into Florida and thinking of ways that in certain areas to target businesses that are maybe have conservative leanings.
Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. I wish we had more time to talk about this and what that means for the future, but we only have time for one more question. So, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
So I think one issue I would have changed my mind on was abortion. So my general outlook on a lot of issues is libertarian in the sense of feeling like I approach questions from the idea of public policy from the perspective of, the idea that government should have a very limited role, and that the role should be primarily focused on protecting life and basic rights, and that otherwise it shouldn't interfere with people and essentially allow them to do what they want as long as they're not harming other people. And so earlier in my life, when I looked at the issue of abortion, I was pro-choice because I thought I agreed with the argument that essentially, it's about bodily autonomy. Somebody can make a decision over their body and they should be interfered with by government. However, when I was in college, I had somebody in my extended family who had a premature birth. And, I went into the NICU unit and I saw the baby who was, maybe 1.5 pounds, and all the other babies who were in there who were, very tiny. And it struck me that, all of these babies were clearly babies. And yet under the sort of more extreme pro-choice position, which is you could have an abortion at any point, essentially the only distinction would be whether the same baby was inside the mother's womb. Suddenly it isn't a life and it's just the mother's choice. Like, you wouldn't say that a mother could throw one of those babies that's in the NICU unit in a dumpster. But if it just happened to be inside the womb, it wouldn't be any different. But, the pro-choice position would be, it's inside the mother's body, so the mother could dispose of it. And that sort of flipped my thinking, because now I thought my libertarian view that the primary legitimate purpose of government was to protect individual life. Suddenly I began thinking about, if that holds, then you would apply that to the baby. And I think that the state has a compelling interest in protecting human life. And then that was sort of me initially thinking of the life issue in a different way, and over time becoming much more rooted, in a pro-life position. And I would now consider myself firmly pro-life, and I wouldn't have when I was a teenager.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests, or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.